Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the blood, soaked sand and splintered wood of ancient Egyptian chariot racing. The spectacle that made gladiatorial combat look like a gentle afternoon tea party and gave us the profound understanding that humans will literally bet on anything, including which direction body parts will fly when physics meets ambition at 30 miles per hour. So before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me explain how entire civilizations organize themselves around spectacular vehicular disasters. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what your local speed limit is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from places where death races aren't considered peak entertainment. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab something strong to drink, and let's ease into tonight's journey through history's most creative approach to turning transportation into a contact sport. So, you think modern extreme sports are dangerous? Sweet summer child, you've clearly never watched 2 tons of horseflesh and Egyptian engineering achieve flight status while the crowd cheers for the debris pattern. So you think you know danger? You think modern extreme sports are wild? Please, you've never stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, watching 2 tons of horseflesh and splintered wood careening towards you at 30 miles per hour while the crowd screams for blood, and the driver's eyes have that special glassy look that says he's already made peace with his gods. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where chariot racing wasn't just entertainment. It was a carefully orchestrated dance with death, performed for the pleasure of pharaohs who considered human life roughly as valuable as yesterday's bread. Let's start with the basics, shall we? You want to be a charioteer in the land of the Nile. First, you need to understand that this isn't some genteel afternoon jaunt through the countryside. This is organized mayhem, sanctioned slaughter, the kind of spectacle that made gladiatorial combat look like a friendly game of checkers. The Egyptians didn't invent chariot racing. That honor probably goes to some forgotten civilization that had the brilliant idea of strapping a cart to a horse and seeing what happened. But they perfected it. They turned it into an art form. A deadly beautiful, utterly terrifying art form. Picture this: the hippodrome of Memphis, stretching out like a massive oval scar in the desert sand. Not some delicate Greek track with marble columns and thoughtful architecture. Oh no. This was Egyptian engineering at its most brutally efficient. Stone barriers that could turn a man into paste. Sand that drank blood like a thirsty desert nomad. And crowds that bayed for destruction with the enthusiasm of jackals around a fresh carcass. The track itself was a masterpiece of lethal design. 7 laps around a course that measured nearly half a mile in circumference, with turns so sharp they made geometry weep. The spina, that central barrier running down the middle, wasn't just decoration, it was a weapon. Carved from limestone and decorated with obelisks, statues, and other delightfully solid objects that could reduce both horse and rider to a red smear if approached with insufficient respect. Those turns at either end, they called them the meta, which sounds pleasant until you realize it's where most charioteers went to die. But before we get to the dying, and trust me, we'll get to plenty of that, let's talk about the horses. Egyptian war horses weren't the gentle ponies you might pet at a petting zoo. These were beasts bred for one purpose: speed at any cost. Arabian stock mostly, with a dash of Nubian blood for that extra spark of insanity. Stallions, almost exclusively, because mares were considered too sensible for this kind of work. And sensibility, my friend, was the enemy of good entertainment. A typical racing team consisted of 2 horses, though some of the more ambitious charioteers, usually the ones with a death wish or gambling debts, would run with 4. The mathematics were simple: more horses meant more speed, but also more opportunities for catastrophic failure. 4 horses meant 4 sets of legs that could tangle, 4 minds that could panic simultaneously, 4 potential sources of the kind of chaos that made crowds stand up and cheer. Training these animals was an art form that bordered on witchcraft. The Egyptians understood something that modern horse whisperers seem to have forgotten. Sometimes you need your animal to be just a little bit insane. A sane horse, when faced with a burning chariot wreck blocking the track ahead, will sensibly slow down or try to go around. An Egyptian racing horse, properly trained, will leap over the obstacle or charge straight through it, depending on which option offers the most spectacular potential for disaster. The chariots themselves were marvels of engineering designed by people who clearly understood that sometimes the best solution to a problem is to make it much, much worse. Light as a feather, strong as iron, and about as stable as a one-legged drunk on a tightrope. The Egyptian racing chariot was essentially a platform on wheels, with just enough structure to keep the driver from immediately falling out and just enough flexibility to ensure that any significant impact would result in what the technical term called catastrophic disassembly. Wood and leather? Mostly, with metal reinforcements in the places where the builders figured they might need them. The wheels were the real works of art, spoked affairs that could cover ground like nothing else in the ancient world, but which also had an unfortunate tendency to come apart under stress. When an Egyptian chariot wheel failed, it didn't just stop working. It exploded. Spokes became projectiles. The rim became a rolling weapon of mass destruction. And the hub, that central piece of carefully crafted wood and metal, became a very effective club for anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. The reins were another masterpiece of dangerous design. Egyptian charioteers didn't hold their reins like some gentle Sunday driver. They tied them around their waists, creating a direct connection between their bodies and the horses' mouths. This meant that if the horses decided to go left and the charioteer wanted to go right, one always. It also meant that if the chariot overturned, and chariots overturned with the regularity of sunrise in Egypt, the driver didn't simply fall off and walk away. He got dragged, at 30 miles per hour, across sand and stone and the occasional abandoned piece of previous chariot. So now you're getting the picture. We're not talking about a leisurely race around a pleasant track. We're talking about a sport designed by people who considered probable death to be a feature, not a bug. But let's talk about the people crazy enough to actually do this for a living. Egyptian charioteers came in several varieties, each with their own particular flavor of insanity. First, you had your professional racers, men who made their living by climbing into death traps and hoping for the best. These were the stars, the celebrities, the ones whose names were carved into monuments, and whose funeral preparations were started the day they began their careers. They lived in a world where fame and mortality were intimately connected, where every race might be their last, and where the difference between glory and being scraped off the track with a wooden spoon was measured in inches. Then you had your amateurs, usually wealthy young men who had convinced themselves that chariot racing was a path to honor and glory. These were the ones who provided most of the entertainment value, since they combined inexperience with overconfidence in ways that made the gods weep with laughter. They would show up to the track dressed in the finest gear money could buy, driving chariots that cost more than most people's houses, completely convinced that expense was an adequate substitute for skill. The professional racers loved these amateurs the way sharks love chum. And finally, you had your condemned criminals and prisoners of war, men who raced not for glory or sport, but because the alternative was immediate execution. These were perhaps the most dangerous competitors of all, because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. A condemned man who could win a chariot race might earn his freedom. More likely, he would earn a slightly more spectacular death than hanging, but hope springs eternal, even in the face of mathematical certainty. The preparation for a race began hours before the actual event, with rituals that would make modern sports psychology look like amateur hour. Charioteers would pray to every god they could think of, make offerings to deities whose names they couldn't pronounce, and generally engage in the kind of desperate bargaining with fate that suggested they understood exactly what they were about to attempt. The horses were prepared with the same attention to detail that modern space programs use for rocket launches. Every strap checked, every harness tested, every piece of equipment examined for the kind of flaws that could turn a competitive race into an impromptu funeral. Not that this preparation prevented disasters, it just meant that when disasters happened, they were usually spectacular enough to be worth the price of admission. The chariots were blessed by priests, decorated with amulets, and generally treated like the sacred objects they essentially were. Because in ancient Egypt, a chariot wasn't just a vehicle, it was a prayer made manifest, a desperate bargain with gods who had a documented sense of humor about human suffering. Race day itself was a festival of controlled chaos that made modern sporting events look like quiet library gatherings. The hippodrome would fill with spectators who came not just to watch racing, but to witness something approaching religious experience. The crowd wasn't there for the sport, they were there for the crashes. They wanted to see chariots explode. They wanted to watch horses tumble. They wanted to witness the precise moment when human ambition met physical reality and lost decisively. The betting was legendary. Egyptians would wager everything they owned on the outcome of a single race, not because they were particularly good at predicting winners, but because the alternative, not betting, was considered a sign of cowardice. Entire fortunes changed hands based on whether a particular charioteer managed to complete 7 laps without becoming one with the track surface. The starting line was a masterpiece of tension. Picture 12 chariots, side by side, each one representing approximately 2,000 pounds of barely controlled kinetic energy. 24 horses, each one trained to explode forward at the sound of a horn, each one perfectly aware that the animals on either side were competitors to be defeated at any cost, and 12 men, each one convinced that this time this race would be different. This time, they would be the ones standing in the winner's circle, instead of being scraped off the spina with a flat shovel. The start was controlled by a system of ropes that would be dropped simultaneously, releasing all that pent-up energy at once. The sound was indescribable, not just the thunder of hooves and the creaking of leather and wood, but the collective roar of a crowd that knew they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. Whether that something would be a brilliant display of skill or a spectacular display of physics gone wrong was entirely up to fate. Those first few seconds were crucial. Chariots that got a good start could position themselves advantageously for the turns ahead. Chariots that got a bad start often found themselves boxed in, forced to make desperate moves that usually ended with them becoming involuntary spectators to their own demise. The key was to find that perfect balance between aggressive positioning and suicidal recklessness, a balance that most charioteers never quite managed to achieve. The first turn was where things typically started to go seriously wrong. Remember, we're talking about chariots moving at speeds that would make modern highway patrol officers reach for their citation books, all trying to navigate a turn that was designed by people who apparently believed that adequate turning radius was for weaklings. Chariots would lean at angles that defied both physics and common sense. Wheels would leave the ground entirely, and occasionally, more than occasionally, the entire contraption would decide that rolling was more fun than staying upright. When a chariot went over in ancient Egypt, it didn't just tip gracefully onto its side like a modern race car. It exploded into component parts with the enthusiasm of a controlled demolition. The body would separate from the wheels. The wheels would separate from their spokes. The spokes would become high-velocity projectiles. And the horses, still tied to whatever remained of the harness, would continue running, dragging whatever pieces of their former chariot hadn't achieved independent flight. The charioteer, remember, was tied to his reins. This meant that when his chariot decided to become several smaller chariots distributed across a wide area, he went along for the ride. Literally, Egyptian racing deaths were rarely quick or clean. They were educational demonstrations in applied physics, showcasing what happened when the human body encountered immovable objects at inadvisable speeds. But here's the thing that made Egyptian chariot racing truly special. The other charioteers didn't stop. Modern racing has safety cars and caution flags, and all sorts of sensible procedures for dealing with accidents. Ancient Egypt had a different philosophy. If you weren't actively on fire, you were expected to keep racing. Crashed chariots became obstacles to be navigated around, over or through, depending on the tactical situation and the charioteer's personal relationship with sanity. This meant that a single accident could trigger a cascade of increasingly spectacular failures. Chariot 1 hits the wall and explodes. Chariot 2 tries to go around the wreckage and gets tangled in the debris. Chariot 3 attempts to leap over both previous chariots and discovers that Egyptian racing chariots weren't actually designed for flight, despite what their speed might suggest. Chariot 4 plows straight through the mess, reasoning that forward momentum could solve any problem that didn't involve running out of forward momentum. The crowd loved this. Each crash was greeted with cheers that could be heard in neighbouring provinces. The more spectacular the failure, the louder the approval. Egyptians had a sophisticated understanding of entertainment value, and they knew that a race where everyone finished safely wasn't worth the price of admission. They wanted to see physics lessons administered at high speed. They wanted to watch human ambition meet its match in the unforgiving mathematics of mass times velocity. The spina, that central barrier, was decorated not just for aesthetic reasons but for practical ones. Those obelisks and statues weren't just there to look impressive. They were there to provide variety in the ways that charioteers could meet their doom. Hit an obelisk at full speed, and you experienced what Egyptian physicians probably classified as comprehensive structural failure. Clip a statue just right, and you might find yourself performing an unscheduled aerial demonstration of human aerodynamics. Lap after lap, the surviving chariots would thunder around the track, their numbers diminishing with each turn. By the halfway point, it was common for half the field to be either wrecked or performing unintentional demonstrations of how far a human body could slide across sand. The remaining charioteers would be running on pure adrenaline and stubbornness, their horses increasingly convinced that this whole racing thing might not have been the career choice their mothers had hoped for. The final laps were exercises in controlled desperation. Charioteers who had survived this long weren't about to let considerations like personal safety or basic physics prevent them from claiming victory. They would attempt passes that violated several laws of nature. They would take turns at speeds that made their chariots scream in protest. They would push their horses to limits that would make modern veterinarians reach for sedatives and lawyers. Victory, when it came, was always temporary. The winning charioteer might get his moment of glory, his victory lap around a track littered with the remains of his competitor's ambitions. He might receive his prize, usually money, sometimes land, occasionally the pharaoh's personal attention, which could be either a blessing or a curse depending on the pharaoh's mood that day. But everyone understood that this victory was simply a postponement. Next week, next month, there would be another race. And the mathematical certainties of Egyptian chariot racing meant that every victory simply brought a charioteer one step closer to becoming a cautionary tale himself. The horses that survived races were often more psychologically damaged than their human counterparts. Egyptian racing horses that lived through multiple seasons developed what modern veterinarians would probably diagnose as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They would flinch at the sound of wheels. They would panic at the sight of other horses. They would require an entire team of handlers just to get them harnessed for the next race. But the real psychological casualties were the spectators. Ancient Egyptians who attended chariot races regularly developed an appreciation for violence that made them ideal candidates for military service or careers in pyramid construction management. They became connoisseurs of destruction, able to predict with uncanny accuracy which chariot would be the first to achieve unplanned disassembly based on subtle factors like wheel wobble or the particular shade of terror in a horse's eyes. The betting pools became increasingly sophisticated as spectators learned to read the signs of impending disaster. Experienced gamblers could spot a doomed chariot from the starting line, recognizing the telltale signs: reins tied too tight, horses that were either too calm or too excited, charioteers who spent too much time praying or too little time checking their equipment. The smart money was never on who would win. It was on who would finish, and in what condition. Egyptian chariot racing produced its own medical specialists, physicians who became expert in treating the specific types of injuries associated with high-speed encounters with immovable objects. These doctors developed techniques for treating compound fractures, traumatic amputations, and the kind of multiple lacerations that resulted from close personal contact with exploding chariots. They also developed a philosophical attitude toward their work that would have impressed Stoic philosophers. They understood that their job was not to prevent death, but to make it slightly less immediate. The track itself became a kind of archaeological site, layered with the remains of racing seasons past. sand that had been mixed with blood and bone fragments, stone barriers that bore the scars of countless impacts, and everywhere, embedded in the racing surface like gruesome decorations, pieces of Chariot that had achieved such complete integration with the track that removing them was considered more trouble than it was worth. Between races, crews would work to clear the most obvious debris and smooth over the worst of the damage, but they never bothered to remove everything. Egyptian racing fans considered these remnants part of the track's character. A piece of wheel hub embedded in the surface near the first turn wasn't just debris. It was a memorial to some long-forgotten charioteer's brief but spectacular contribution to the sport. The social structure surrounding chariot racing was complex and brutal. Successful charioteers became celebrities, but celebrities of a very specific type. The kind whose fame was measured not in years, but in races survived. They lived in a world where every public appearance might be their last, where every meal might be their final one, where every sunrise was a gift that couldn't be taken for granted. These men developed their own culture, their own rituals, their own ways of dealing with the mathematical certainty of violent death. They would gather in taverns near the hippodrome, sharing stories of races past and strategies for races future, all while carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that most of them wouldn't live to see 30. They developed superstitions that would make modern athletes look rational by comparison, refusing to change tunics between races, insisting on specific pre-race meals, performing elaborate rituals designed to curry favor with gods who seemed to take a distinctly hands-off approach to charioteer welfare. The families of charioteers lived in a state of perpetual mourning preparation. Wives learned to identify their husbands by pieces of jewelry or distinctive scars, since facial recognition became problematic after a few seasons of racing. Children grew up understanding that their fathers were heroes, but heroes of the temporary variety, the kind whose heroism was inevitably followed by elaborate funeral arrangements. Egyptian chariot racing also produced its own economy of supporting industries. Chariot builders who specialized in vehicles, designed to be spectacular when they failed, horse trainers who could produce animals capable of both incredible speed and complete indifference to the screams of dying competitors, undertakers who could reconstruct a recognizable human form from the kind of scattered remains that Egyptian racing typically produced. The gambling industry alone employed hundreds of people, from the sophisticated mathematicians who calculated odds based on track conditions and charioteer survival rates, to the collections specialists who ensured that betting debts were paid regardless of whether the debtor had survived the race they had wagered on. Egyptian bookmakers developed collection techniques that would have impressed modern organized crime figures, operating under the principle that death was not an adequate excuse for defaulting on gambling debts. Track maintenance required its own specialized workforce. Engineers who could design barriers strong enough to stop runaway chariots without being so effective that they eliminated the entertainment value of spectacular crashes. Sand specialists who understood the precise mixture of grain sizes needed to provide adequate traction for racing, while still being soft enough to cushion the impact of falling charioteers. And of course, clean-up crews who could clear a track of debris, body parts, and traumatized horses quickly enough to keep the day's racing schedule on time. The religious aspects of chariot racing were as elaborate as they were ultimately ineffective. Every race was preceded by ceremonies designed to ensure the favor of the gods, or at least to convince them to look the other way during the particularly gruesome parts. Priests would bless the chariots, the horses, the charioteers, and the track itself, creating a comprehensive spiritual safety net that proved remarkably ineffective at preventing the kinds of accidents that made Egyptian racing famous. These religious ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond the obvious spiritual insurance policy. They provided employment for a substantial priestly class. They gave spectators something to do while the betting pools closed, and they created a convenient excuse when divine intervention failed to manifest in the form of fewer fatalities. When a race ended with the usual quota of deaths and dismemberments, it wasn't because the gods didn't care about chariot racing. It was because the will of the gods was mysterious and not to be questioned by mere mortals. The seasonal nature of Egyptian racing created its own rhythm of anticipation and mourning. The racing season would begin with elaborate opening ceremonies, featuring parades of new charioteers who looked forward to careers that would likely be measured in weeks rather than years. Fresh horses would be displayed, new chariots would be unveiled, and everyone would pretend that this season would be different, that somehow the fundamental mathematics of high-speed collision would work out differently this time. Mid-season races had a different character entirely. By then, the initial optimism had been replaced by grim determination. The surviving charioteers had developed the 1,000-yard stare that came from watching too many colleagues achieve unscheduled intimate contact with solid objects. The horses had learned to recognize the sound that chariots made when they exploded and had developed their own opinions about continued participation in this particular form of entertainment. End of season races were exercises in pure fatalism. Anyone who had survived that long had achieved something approaching mythical status, not because they were particularly skilled, but because they had somehow managed to avoid the statistical inevitability that governed their profession. These final races were attended by crowds who came not to see racing, but to witness the conclusion of what everyone understood to be extended death scenes. The off-season was when the real business of Egyptian chariot racing took place. Chariot builders would work frantically to develop new designs that promised to be even more spectacular in their failures than the previous year's models. Horse traders would scour the known world for animals that combined speed with the kind of mental instability that made for exciting racing, and undertakers would restock their supplies, knowing that the coming season would provide them with steady employment and an ongoing education in creative approaches to human disassembly. Between seasons, the hippodrome would be repaired and renovated, but never in ways that made racing safer. Safety was not the goal, entertainment value was. Track modifications were designed to provide new and interesting ways for chariots to fail, new obstacles for horses to navigate around or through, new opportunities for physics to demonstrate its superiority over human ambition in the most visually spectacular ways possible. The evolution of Egyptian chariot racing over the centuries showed a consistent trend toward increased deadliness. Each generation of race organizers felt obligated to outdo their predecessors, not in terms of safety or sporting excellence, but in terms of sheer destructive spectacle. Tracks became more dangerous. Chariots became less stable. Horses were bred for speed at the expense of every other consideration, including survival instinct. This escalation was driven by audience demand. Egyptian crowds were sophisticated consumers of violence, who demanded constantly increasing levels of spectacular destruction. A race that would have satisfied spectators in one generation was considered boring by the next. The bar was constantly raised, and that bar was usually measured in terms of fatalities per event rather than any conventional sporting metric. The international aspects of Egyptian chariot racing created diplomatic challenges that modern sports administrators couldn't imagine. When foreign dignitaries visited Egypt, they expected to be entertained with chariot races that showcased Egyptian hospitality. This meant organizing events that were spectacular enough to impress visitors who had presumably seen their own forms of violent entertainment, while hopefully avoiding the kind of complete massacre that might create international incidents. These diplomatic races required careful management. The level of carnage had to be calibrated to provide appropriate entertainment value without completely horrifying foreign guests who might not share Egyptian attitudes toward recreational death. This was a delicate balance, since what Egyptians considered a mild afternoon's entertainment might strike visitors from more civilized nations as evidence of complete social breakdown. The training facilities for Egyptian charioteers were essentially elaborate suicide preparation centers. Young men would be taught the fundamentals of chariot handling, horse management, and track strategy, all while carefully avoiding any mention of the statistical realities of their chosen profession. Instructors would focus on technique and tactics, discussing the finer points of turn negotiation and passing strategy as if these skills were likely to be relevant for more than a few races. These training programs produced charioteers who were technically skilled, but psychologically unprepared for the reality of Egyptian racing. They would enter their first race convinced that their training had prepared them for success, only to discover that no amount of preparation could adequately address the fundamental problem of two-ton vehicles moving at deadly speeds with drivers whose primary qualification was a willingness to climb aboard. The medical facilities at Egyptian racing venues were marvels of trauma surgery that would have impressed modern emergency room physicians. Doctors who worked the races developed techniques for treating injuries that most physicians would never encounter in normal practice. They became experts in battlefield medicine, developing rapid treatment protocols for the kinds of wounds that resulted from intimate contact with exploding vehicles. These medical professionals maintained detailed records of racing injuries, creating what amounted to the world's first database of high-speed trauma. Their case studies read like physics textbooks illustrated with human anatomy, documenting the various ways that flesh and bone responded to sudden encounters with immovable objects at inadvisable velocities. The economic impact of Egyptian chariot racing extended far beyond the obvious gambling and entertainment revenue. The sport created entire industries dedicated to supporting activities that any rational society would have banned immediately. Specialized craftsmen developed techniques for creating vehicles that were optimized for spectacular destruction. Animal trainers developed methods for producing horses that combined blazing speed with complete indifference to their own survival. Insurance, in the modern sense, didn't exist in ancient Egypt, but chariot racing created the need for primitive forms of risk management. Wealthy families would pool resources to cover the costs of replacing charioteers who achieved permanent integration with track surfaces. Lending institutions developed special protocols for dealing with loans to people whose life expectancy could be measured in racing seasons. The social mobility offered by chariot racing was both dramatic and brief. A successful charioteer could rise from obscurity to celebrity status in a single season, accumulating wealth and fame that would have taken decades to achieve in more conventional professions. Of course, the same mathematical principles that made rapid advancement possible also ensured that most charioteers' careers ended with equal rapidity, just in more permanent ways. This created a unique social dynamic where extreme wealth and extreme mortality risk were intimately connected. Charioteers lived like kings while preparing for deaths that would make their funerals more expensive than most people's houses. They developed spending habits that reflected their understanding of temporal economics. When your career might end at any moment, saving for retirement becomes a theoretical exercise. The technological innovations driven by chariot racing had lasting impacts on Egyptian society. Engineers who learned to build vehicles capable of surviving high-speed crashes for at least a few laps applied those same principles to military chariots, making Egyptian armies more mobile and more effective in battle. The medical advances driven by racing injuries improved trauma care throughout Egyptian society, making the kingdom more capable of dealing with the various forms of violence that characterized ancient life. Metallurgy advanced as craftsmen sought to create stronger, lighter components for racing chariots. Leather working evolved as artisans developed new techniques for creating harnesses that could withstand the incredible stresses of racing while still being flexible enough to allow horses to achieve maximum speed. Even agricultural techniques improved, as horse breeders developed new methods for producing animals that combined the physical requirements of racing with the psychological characteristics needed to perform in an environment where death was a constant presence. The cultural impact of chariot racing on Egyptian society was profound and lasting. The sport influenced art, with sculptures and paintings depicting the drama and violence of racing in ways that made the events seem almost heroic rather than simply suicidal. Literature incorporated racing themes, creating epic poems that celebrated the brief, violent careers of famous charioteers while carefully avoiding too much focus on the statistical realities of the profession. Religious practices evolved to accommodate the spiritual needs of people who worked in an industry where violent death was not just possible but probable. Special prayers were developed for charioteers, their families, and the horses that shared their dangerous profession. Funeral rituals were modified to address the practical challenges of commemorating people whose remains might be distributed across several acres of racetrack. The architectural legacy of Egyptian chariot racing can still be seen in the ruins of hippodromes throughout the former Egyptian Empire. These massive structures were built to contain and channel the violent energies of racing, creating spaces where controlled destruction could be safely observed by thousands of spectators. The engineering required to build these venues pushed the boundaries of ancient construction technology, creating amphitheaters that were marvels of structural design and crowd management. Even the language of ancient Egypt was influenced by chariot racing. New words were coined to describe the various forms of spectacular failure that the sport regularly produced. Technical terms were developed to classify different types of crashes, different categories of injury, and different degrees of chariot disintegration. The vocabulary of Egyptian racing became so specialized that understanding it required extensive study, creating what amounted to a professional jargon for discussing violent death as a form of entertainment. The legacy of Egyptian chariot racing extended far beyond Egypt itself. Other civilizations observed Egyptian racing and attempted to create their own versions, usually with results that made Egyptian racing look safe by comparison. The fundamental principles of the sport, high speeds, inadequate safety measures, and audience demand for spectacular destruction, proved to be remarkably exportable, creating an ancient world where chariot racing became synonymous with civilization itself. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Egyptian chariot racing was its demonstration of humanity's seemingly infinite capacity for turning any activity, no matter how dangerous, into organized entertainment. The sport proved that people would not only watch others risk their lives for amusement, but would pay good money for the privilege, bet on the outcomes, and demand increasingly spectacular forms of destruction as a form of sporting evolution. In the end, Egyptian chariot racing was more than just a sport. It was a perfect expression of ancient priorities, a demonstration of values that placed entertainment value above human life, and a lasting testament to the creativity that humans can display when devising new ways to risk everything for the temporary approval of crowds who would forget their names before the sand had been cleaned from their remains. So the next time you think modern extreme sports are dangerous, remember the charioteers of ancient Egypt. Remember the men who tied themselves to horses and trusted in luck, skill, and the occasional intervention of gods, who seem to have better things to do than prevent spectacular accidents. Remember that these men climbed into vehicles designed to explode on impact, raced around tracks designed to maximize destructive potential, and did it all for the entertainment of crowds who measured success not in victories, but in the creativity and completeness of failures. They called it sport. History calls it madness. And somewhere in between those two definitions lies the truth about what happens when human ambition meets physics at 30 miles per hour with predictable and invariably spectacular results. The psychological profiles of Egyptian charioteers revealed fascinating insights into the human capacity for self-deception. These men weren't suicidal in the traditional sense. They genuinely believed they could beat the odds that had claimed hundreds of their predecessors. They developed elaborate personal mythologies to explain why they would be different, why their particular combination of skill, luck, and divine favor would allow them to retire with all their limbs intact and their names carved in something more permanent than tombstones. Some believed their success depended on ritual observances so complex they required full-time assistants just to keep track of them all. They would eat only certain foods on race days, wear amulets that had supposedly protected previous champions, and perform elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure that the gods were paying attention to their particular chariot rather than being distracted by the dozen other men, making similar requests for divine intervention. Others convinced themselves that chariot racing was fundamentally a matter of technique, that the right approach to turn negotiation and the proper understanding of horse psychology could overcome the basic mathematical realities of mass, velocity, and impact resistance. These men would spend hours studying track layouts, analyzing the wreckage patterns of previous races, and developing sophisticated theories about optimal racing lines that would supposedly allow them to avoid the fate that had befallen their colleagues. The most delusional charioteers believed that their predecessors had simply been unlucky, that the sport wasn't actually as dangerous as the casualty statistics suggested, and that most racing deaths resulted from easily avoidable mistakes rather than the fundamental incompatibility between human fragility and high-speed physics demonstrations. These men would enter races with the confidence of people who had never actually seen a chariot explode at close range, convinced that reasonable caution and basic competence were adequate protection against forces that could reduce both horse and driver to their component atoms. The betting pools that surrounded Egyptian chariot racing developed their own sophisticated methodologies for predicting outcomes, creating what amounted to the ancient world's first systematic approach to risk analysis. Professional gamblers would study everything from weather conditions to the personal relationships between charioteers, reasoning that a driver distracted by domestic problems was more likely to make the kind of tactical errors that resulted in spectacular educational experiences for everyone watching. Track conditions became a science unto themselves. Experienced bettors could evaluate sand moisture, wind direction, and temperature variations to predict which sections of the track would be most likely to claim victims during any particular race. They understood that racing on newly repaired track surfaces was different from racing on tracks that had been broken in by previous carnage, and that the debris field from earlier races could create hazards that would persist for entire racing seasons. The social dynamics between charioteers added another layer of complexity to an already lethal sport. Rivalries that developed between drivers didn't remain confined to good-natured competitive spirit. They evolved into blood feuds that played out at 30 miles per hour in front of crowds that appreciated the entertainment value of personal vendettas, resolved through vehicular combat. Charioteers would deliberately target their enemies during races, using their chariots as weapons in grudge matches that made standard racing look like a peaceful afternoon stroll. These personal conflicts created additional betting opportunities, as spectators could wager not just on who would win, but on which particular charioteer would be responsible for which other charioteer's demise. The odds on specific matchups became incredibly sophisticated, taking into account factors like previous encounters, known tactical preferences, and the psychological profiles of drivers who might be more or less likely to prioritize personal revenge over race victory. The horses used in Egyptian chariot racing developed their own psychological adaptations to their dangerous profession, creating behavioral patterns that would have fascinated modern animal psychologists. Racing horses that survived multiple seasons began to exhibit what could only be described as fatalistic acceptance of their circumstances. They would approach each race with the resigned determination of soldiers heading into battle, understanding that survival was largely a matter of chance, but that refusing to participate wasn't an option. Some horses developed what their handlers called track sense, an uncanny ability to predict when other chariots were about to fail catastrophically. These animals would instinctively avoid sections of track where accidents were imminent, sometimes saving both themselves and their drivers from becoming involuntary participants in other people's disasters. Of course, this same survival instinct could also cause horses to refuse jumps over wreckage or to shy away from aggressive passing maneuvers, leading to accusations of cowardice that completely missed the point about which species had a more realistic understanding of physics. The economic ecosystem that developed around chariot racing created opportunities for entrepreneurship that wouldn't be matched until the invention of modern insurance fraud. Enterprising individuals developed businesses based entirely on the reliable production of spectacular failures, creating services that capitalized on the mathematical certainty of disaster while maintaining the entertainment value that kept crowds coming back for more. Chariot rental services allowed wealthy amateurs to participate in racing without the substantial upfront investment required to purchase their own vehicles, while also providing a steady stream of replacement equipment for the inevitable moments when expensive racing chariots were transformed into expensive piles of splinters. These rental agreements included clauses that would have impressed modern lawyers, specifying exactly which pieces of chariot the renter was responsible for returning and in what condition. Specialized recovery services developed techniques for extracting both human and equine participants from the wreckage of failed racing attempts, creating what amounted to ancient Egypt's first emergency response industry. These recovery specialists became expert in determining which pieces of a post-crash debris field had originally been part of the chariot, which had been part of the horses, and which had been part of the driver. Skills that proved surprisingly transferable to other applications in a society where violent death was a common occupational hazard. The funeral industry experienced unprecedented growth during the height of Egyptian chariot racing's popularity, not just because of increased demand for burial services, but because racing deaths required specialized approaches that went far beyond conventional funeral preparation. Traditional embalming techniques had to be modified to address the practical challenges of preserving remains that might be distributed across several square furlongs of racetrack, leading to innovations in mortuary science that influenced Egyptian burial practices for centuries. Memorial services for deceased charioteers became elaborate affairs that celebrated the entertainment value of their deaths as much as their lives, creating ceremonies that combined mourning with highlight reels of their most spectacular crashes. These services often drew larger crowds than the original races, as people who had missed the actual death could still participate in the communal appreciation of its artistic merit and technical execution. The artistic community embraced chariot racing as a subject matter that combined action, drama, and reliable narrative closure, creating works that depicted the sport's violence with an aesthetic sensibility that made mass destruction seem almost beautiful. Painters developed techniques for capturing the precise moment when chariots transitioned from vehicles to debris fields, creating static images that somehow conveyed the dynamic energy of high-speed disintegration. Sculptors faced the challenge of representing motion and destruction in media that were fundamentally static and permanent, leading to artistic innovations that influenced Egyptian art for generations. The best racing sculptures managed to convey not just the physical drama of chariot crashes, but the psychological intensity of men who had chosen to risk everything for the temporary approval of crowds who would forget their names within days of their deaths. Literature inspired by chariot racing created new narrative forms that reflected the sport's unique combination of heroism and mathematical inevitability. Epic poems about famous charioteers had to balance celebration of their achievements with acknowledgement of their invariably spectacular endings, creating works that were simultaneously inspirational and cautionary tales about the relationship between human ambition and physical reality. The religious implications of chariot racing created theological challenges that kept Egyptian priests busy for centuries. The sport raised fundamental questions about divine justice, human free will, and the extent to which gods could be expected to intervene in situations where people insisted on ignoring basic principles of self-preservation. Priests developed elaborate explanations for why the gods allowed chariot racing to continue despite its obvious incompatibility with human longevity, creating doctrinal interpretations that managed to make mass carnage seem like part of a larger divine plan. Some religious scholars argued that chariot racing served as a form of accelerated natural selection, identifying and removing from the gene pool individuals whose judgment was sufficiently poor that they might otherwise pass these traits on to future generations. This interpretation suggested that the gods actively supported chariot racing as a mechanism for improving human genetic quality, though it failed to explain why the gods seemed so indifferent to the quality of entertainment provided by the resulting deaths. Others maintained that chariot racing was a test of faith, challenging participants to demonstrate their trust in divine protection while simultaneously engaging in activities that made such protection essentially impossible. According to this interpretation, charioteers who died in races had failed tests of spiritual strength, while those who survived had proven their worthiness for continued divine favor, at least until their next race. The international diplomatic aspects of chariot racing created challenges that extended far beyond simple entertainment provision. When foreign dignitaries visited Egypt expecting to be entertained with racing, Egyptian officials had to balance their guests' expectations with the practical reality that hosting spectacular chariot races required a steady supply of people willing to die for the amusement of others. Diplomatic races required careful participant selection, ensuring that the drivers chosen for these events possess the right combination of skill and expendability to provide appropriate entertainment value without creating international incidents. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed Egyptian chariot racing returned to their home countries with stories that either enhanced Egypt's reputation as a civilization that understood entertainment or raised serious questions about Egyptian sanity, depending on their cultural perspective. Some visiting dignitaries were so impressed by Egyptian racing that they attempted to establish similar sports in their own territories, usually with results that made Egyptian racing look like a model of safety and organization. These international variations on chariot racing created a competitive dynamic between civilizations, with each nation feeling obligated to outdo their neighbors in terms of spectacular destruction and creative approaches to vehicular mayhem. The seasonal rhythms of Egyptian chariot racing created cultural patterns that influenced everything from agricultural scheduling to military planning. The racing calendar became a fundamental organizing principle for Egyptian society, with other activities planned around the demands of providing adequate entertainment for crowds that had developed sophisticated expectations about the quality and quantity of destruction they expected to witness. Pre-season preparations involved not just the obvious requirements of training charioteers and breeding horses, but also the less obvious logistical challenges of ensuring adequate supplies of medical personnel, funeral services, and cleanup equipment. Race organizers had to coordinate with multiple industries to ensure that the infrastructure necessary for managing large-scale carnage was in place before the first chariot took to the track. Mid-season modifications to racing rules and track design reflected ongoing efforts to maintain audience interest in a sport where the fundamental entertainment mechanism, spectacular failure, could become predictable if not regularly updated with new variations. Track engineers would introduce new obstacles, modify turn configurations, and adjust racing distances to ensure that each season provided fresh opportunities for charioteers to discover innovative ways to violate basic principles of physics. End-of-season ceremonies celebrated not just the year's winners, but also the year's most spectacular failures, creating awards categories that recognized achievement in creative destruction alongside more conventional measures of racing success. These ceremonies became cultural events that attracted participants from throughout the Egyptian empire, creating festivals that combined athletic celebration with communal appreciation for the artistic merit of well-executed disasters. The technological legacy of Egyptian chariot racing influenced transportation design throughout the ancient world, as engineers applied lessons learned from building vehicles designed to fail spectacularly to the challenge of building vehicles designed to survive normal use. Military chariots incorporated design elements originally developed for racing, creating war machines that combined the speed necessary for battlefield effectiveness with structural integrity sufficient to survive encounters with enemy forces, rather than simply providing entertainment value through catastrophic disassembly. Agricultural equipment benefited from innovations in wheel design and axle engineering that were originally developed to withstand the stresses of racing until the moment of spectacular failure. These improvements made farming more efficient throughout Egypt, creating economic benefits that indirectly subsidized the continued development of increasingly dangerous forms of recreational vehicle destruction. Construction techniques used in building racing facilities were adapted for other large-scale architectural projects, creating engineering knowledge that was applied to pyramid construction, temple building, and urban planning. The expertise developed in designing structures that could safely contain and channel the destructive energies of chariot racing proved useful in many other applications where the controlled management of potentially dangerous forces was required. The medical advances driven by chariot racing created treatment protocols that were applied throughout Egyptian society, improving survival rates for victims of construction accidents, military injuries, and various other forms of trauma that were common in ancient life. Emergency medicine in Egypt became more sophisticated and effective largely because physicians had regular opportunities to practice treating the kinds of catastrophic injuries that racing produced with such reliable frequency. Surgical techniques developed to address racing injuries were refined and improved over generations of medical practitioners who specialized in treating the specific forms of damage that resulted from high-speed encounters with immovable objects. These specialists became experts in trauma surgery who could perform procedures that would have impressed modern emergency room doctors, working under conditions that would have challenged contemporary medical facilities. The social mobility offered by chariot racing created unique opportunities for individuals from lower social classes to achieve rapid advancement through the simple expedient of surviving activities that killed most of their competitors. Successful charioteers could accumulate wealth and status that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional career paths, though the price of this advancement was measured in life expectancy rather than conventional currency. This created a social dynamic where extreme risk-taking became a legitimate strategy for economic advancement, influencing Egyptian attitudes toward entrepreneurship and personal achievement in ways that persisted long after individual charioteers had achieved permanent integration with track surfaces. The example of racing success encouraged people in other professions to take calculated risks that sometimes resulted in substantial rewards, though rarely at the cost of immediate physical dismemberment. The cultural impact of chariot racing on Egyptian concepts of heroism and achievement was profound and lasting, creating social values that celebrated spectacular failure alongside conventional success. Egyptian literature and art developed themes that portrayed tragic endings as potentially more meaningful than happy ones, reflecting a society that had learned to find entertainment value in the kinds of disasters that other civilizations would have considered simply unfortunate. This aesthetic appreciation for spectacular destruction influenced Egyptian approaches to warfare architecture and even personal relationships, creating a cultural framework that saw beauty in the moment of catastrophic failure and meaning in the brief instant when human ambition encountered immovable reality. The artistic sensibility developed through generations of chariot racing spectatorship created a civilization that understood drama, appreciated tragedy, and found entertainment value in the fundamental incompatibility between human dreams and physical law. And so Egyptian chariot racing stands as perhaps the purest expression of humanity's relationship with risk, entertainment, and the mathematical certainties that govern physical existence. It was a sport that perfectly captured the ancient world's understanding of the relationship between individual ambition and collective entertainment, creating spectacular demonstrations of physics principles that were educational, inspirational, and inevitably fatal. The legacy of these races echoes through history, not because they were safe or sensible, but because they represented something fundamentally human: the willingness to risk everything for the temporary approval of crowds who understood that the real entertainment lay not in victory, but in the creativity and completeness with which human ambition could be transformed into high-velocity object lessons about the relationship between flesh and stone, speed and stopping, dreams and the immutable laws that govern falling objects and the people who fall from them.